Hey guys, it's Filter SC here, and I'm back for Terran episode number 13, in which we're going to cover Terran drop play. Now, I've really been looking forward to covering drop play because I think it's one of the most misunderstood areas of the Terran game, and I think a lot of Terran players really rely too much on the drop, and they end up getting to a league where they simply can't macro out if somebody is able to defend their drops. They end up, having some really frustrating games because their drop play is simply not working for them anymore. It's a really common thing with Terrans, and it's frustrating to see. Like, a lot of Terran players will have like 35, 36 SCVs in Masters, and they solely win because they just drop their opponent non-stop. Now, what ends up happening is you hit opponents that A, defend your drops, and then B, from defending your drops, will just go across the map and crush you. So you have to be very careful in terms of how you're utilizing your drop play. And what makes good drop play successful, right? If you watch a lot of professional games, drop play is by far the most exciting thing you see. There's nothing better than watching, Marine King Prime or, MMA back when he was in his absolute prime, when he was microing 3 different drops at once, and they're, all getting picked up and just doing tons of damage to your opponent. Everybody sees that and they go, I want to do that. And then you go on ladder and you do your big drop with stim and combat shield and all that fun stuff, and you just crush your opponent with your drop. The problem is, as your opponents get better and better and better, that drop might not even get into the base anymore. Or if it does, they'll respond to it very quickly and they'll take very little damage from it. So one of the big things about drop play is it's really important that you realize if you are too heavily reliant, you go back and you look at your replays and you're like, wow, I win a lot of games just because my opponent was, mishandled my drop and he was doing a poor job of that. You want to be really careful about nipping this one in the bud, because it can really come back to bite you in terms of the rest of your own overall gameplay, and it's actually very difficult to start to learn how to drop properly if you're doing it too late into the game. So one of the biggest areas where people kind of hit that bad drop wall is in Masters, because once players start getting into Masters League, there's very few guys out there. If somebody has like a 35 or 40% win rate against Terran, they probably can't defend drops. But there's a lot of people out there with 55, 60, 70% win rates against Terran players simply because they know how to defend drops, and a lot of Terran players on ladder rely super heavily on drops. So in this particular episode, we're going to talk about proper drop play, how to execute your drops, and how to think about them a little bit more before you start randomly picking up your units and trying to be MMA. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I call proper drop play. What is proper drop play? Well, it's a very general, loose term, but basically proper drop play is when you go in with just a single medivac of units in the early game, and then in the mid game or kind of the late game you go in with like 2 medivacs. But in the early game you really only want to go in with like 1 medivac, maybe 1 medivac to each base if they're spread out and they've already got 3 different bases. And you want to make sure you go in, you land, you start picking off overlords, you start picking off supply depots, SCVs, whatever is available and close to you. You're not trying to gun down a hatchery with your drop, because what will happen is you'll do 75% damage to the hatch or 25%, whatever, and then you'll have to pick up and leave and you won't have done any damage. Or you'll try to finish off whatever you're trying to kill, and all your units get mopped up, and then that drop is no longer a threat. So when I talk about proper drop play, what I mean is you take a singular medevac, you drop it in your opponent's base, you start gunning down, queens, drones, probes, SCVs, buildings like missile turrets, so it makes it easier to drop the next time. You want to look for, upgrade structures, forges, tech like robo bays, Templar archives is a great one to snipe. You want to snipe all those kind of low health buildings that you can pick off very quickly and get out. Pylons, supply depots, all that stuff is great to kill. By and large, you're not looking to kill things like barracks. Factories are not a big deal. You want to kill like reactors and tech labs. Maybe killing a starport is okay, but you're better off to get like the armory and maybe an engineering bay or something than you are to really go after and kill barracks, right? So it's really important that you're targeting the right buildings when you go in for your drop. Once the SCVs pull, you don't want to chase the SCVs after they pull because you're just going to run into units of your opponent, right? What you're trying to do is get damage in. And it's really important you get guaranteed damage. Now, the easiest guaranteed damage are workers, but from there you're looking for your other buildings, like your tech structures, and you're trying to avoid production, basically, with some exceptions, like the Robo Bay is one big exception, but other than that, you're looking for tech, right? That's kind of the big thing. Now, the other big thing with doing proper drop play is rather than picking up your whole army and slamming down like 3 medevacs into your opponent's base, if your opponent's bad, he's just going to straight up lose that. However, if your opponent is good, he's going to pull his army back, he's going to defend, he's going to crush your drop is no longer a threat, and then he's going to move across the map and kill you. So what you really have to practice doing when you're doing drop play is keep it simple. When you're first learning to do it the right way, just keep it to a single medevac with a few Marines in it. Go out, hit your drop, get your damage in, and as soon as your opponent comes to defend, if it's just a few lings, get a good position, be patient, and then pick up and leave, right? You want to be really careful about kind of how you're handling your overall drop, right? Any situation where your opponent is going to kill the medevac, obviously, like a bunch of blink stalkers come in, you just have to leave your drop and hope it does enough damage. But most of the time, you're going to have the opportunity to pick up your drop, boost away, and get in your damage, and then you just hang your drop out. Your drop just sits by his base. If it's a Zerg, you have to go land it somewhere because Mutalisk can come pick it off. But for the most part, what you want to do is just have your drop as a threat. As soon as your opponent kind of feels like he's relaxing a little bit more, you go poke in with your drop. He doesn't have any units there again. Cool, I can start doing more damage. Maybe he only has 2 units there, and you can drop off, kill those 2 units, and then start doing damage. But it's really, really important you're not trying to drop too much to the point where you can't handle it, right? If you're trying to drop 3 places at once, yeah, that's really, really hard to deal with for your opponent, but you only want to do that in the real late game. Because you simply won't have the micro to be able to handle all 3 drops at once. 1 or 2 or all 3 are going to get killed, and you're going to put yourself in a really bad spot. So it's really important that when you are doing correct drop play, you're just using a single medevac, you're dropping the units off, and you're picking it back up. You'll be blown away by how effective it is just to have a single medevac, constantly dropping your opponent, constantly harassing your opponent, and not losing those units inside of that medevac. It will make a big difference in your drop gameplay. Alright, so let's go ahead and just talk about the 5 different kinds of drops that exist in StarCraft 2, explain a little bit about them, how they work, and what the point of them is, so that you understand. One of the worst things people do is they go, well, I have medevacs now, I guess I'm going to drop, because that's what they see the pros do. And that's not at all how it works. Generally, you're much better off when you have 2 or 4 medevacs to just push your opponent, take map control, clear out watchtowers, check to see maybe he just doesn't have enough units, and you can attack. Because you have to remember, when you have those medevacs, you can push, you can clear creep, you can maybe even do a lot of damage and win the game straight up. But if all you do is just load up into your medevacs and fly away, and then the drops get defended, you didn't accomplish anything, right? So it's really important that you understand why you're dropping, when you're dropping, what your drops are accomplishing, before you go out and just load up your whole army into a whole bunch of different medevacs. Now, there's 5 different drops in StarCraft 2, and we're going to talk about them all right now. So the 5 different drops that I've kind of identified are what's called a planned drop, what's called positional drops, damage drops, doom drops, and suicide drops, aka hellbat drops. So we're going to go through these in order, and we'll kind of explain how each of them works, when you should be using them, and how you want to use them. Alright, so the first type of drop I mentioned is what's called a planned drop. Now, when you first start watching pro games, you're going to see a lot of really, really early drops where it's a single medevac, a few Marines, a couple Widow Mines, maybe some Hellions, whatever. It could be, there's a whole bunch of different drops that you can do. Now, these are called planned drops because what they are is they're fast tech to medevac drops to hopefully catch their opponent off guard, and get him with a fairly even amount of units so that you can do some damage. There's a whole bunch of different types of planned drops out there, and I'm not going to cover all of them. But basically, when you have a build order, and a player like Flash is a really good example of this, where his build order has a planned drop in it. Like in TBT, he's going to do a drop at X time, and he's going to do it every game, no matter what. And it's hopefully going to do damage. But if it doesn't do damage, it's kind of accounted for that the units involved in the drop are not going to be with his main army a little bit later. Most of the time, however, though, it's going to be cost effective. So a really good example of a planned drop would be when you open 15 gas into barracks, into factory, in a starport, and along that you're getting an expansion at the same time. And what ends up happening is you're going to get 4 Marines and 2 Widow Mines out of that, basically at the exact same time the medevac finishes from your starport. Now, when all this happens, you load your 4 Marines, your 2 Widow Mines, and you go drop your opponent. This is a really, really good, powerful, strong drop. Flash knows what he's doing. This drop is, it has a very specific purpose. It's looking to do damage against an opponent that is not prepared. In a lot of cases, it can give you a build order win because your opponent is just skimping on something or forgetting something. And it's really important that you see these types of drops and you don't go, okay, well, I can do this as, I got 3 barracks, then I got my factory, then I got this. No, when you're doing a planned drop, you have to basically already have the idea in your head that you're going to do this drop. right at the start of the game, so that it hits at a very good time when your opponent's not prepared for it. If you try to do a planned drop that you saw somebody else do, and your drop hits like 2 minutes later than what the other person was doing, your drop's just not going to do very much damage because your opponent is going to have a lot more stuff, right? So it's really important you think a lot about how your planned drop is going to work before you start trying to do those drops with your first initial medivacs. Alright, so the next kind of drop I'm going to talk about are what's called positional drops. Now, positional drops can have a number of different purposes, but basically the main reason to use them is to put your opponent's army in a position that you want it to be in, right? So a positional drop could be trying to pull your opponent's army outside of, from between the natural and the third into the main, so that you can run up and snipe a base or do a little bit of damage at the front with your main army. So it's really important if you're doing that type of positional drop that your main army is positioned aggressively. So you walk your whole army across the map, then you load up a medivac, you go fly to his main, whatever. You wait for his army to come, then you pick up and leave, right? And maybe he'll leave some units to defend that, and then you push the front, right? It's a really good way to kind of get position on your opponent. The other way you can use positional drops is if your opponent is forced to defend the drops and can't move out, well, you either tech up or take extra bases, right? So if I'm playing a TVT and I constantly drop my opponent with, these two medivacs that I have on either side of his base that are both loaded with Marines, my opponent realistically cannot move out until he's going to be capable with dealing with the Marines at home as well as killing me at my base, right? If my opponent has to leave like 16 to 20 or even like 25 Marines at home, or maybe like 15 Marines and 2 siege tanks, in order to be able to deal with both of those drops, his push is going to be significantly weaker. Therefore, I know I'm pretty safe to tech up. I don't need siege tanks right away. I can get them after I secure my third base. There's lots of options for me, right? And that's because I'm using positional drops correctly. It's really important that these drops are not designed to do damage. You want to keep your opponent kind of pinned back, and if you lose one of these drops and you're trying to do a positional drop play, you're going to put yourself at a huge disadvantage. So if you're going for positional drop play to keep your opponent pinned to his base, and you drop with, both medivacs at the same time, and you lose both armies, and you do a bunch of damage to your opponent's economy or something, you're going to end up losing the game because you trigger your opponent to attack in a situation where you're not prepared to deal with his army. And this happens to a lot of different Terran players out there, right? Where they go in, you'll kill like 15, 20 SCVs, a couple supply depots, a reactor, tons of damage, but you lose everything, and then your opponent goes, well, I'm so behind now, I have to attack, and you're not prepared to deal with this attack, and you lose the game. I know it's happened to me, I'm sure it's happened to some of you guys out there, so it's really important that when you're doing that kind of positional drop play, you understand you're kind of rushing into his base, you're picking off, a couple of SCVs, whatever, and then as soon as you see his army, you're picking up and you're leaving. And that's going to keep him in his base because he can't leave until he deals with those two medivacs. One of the easiest ways to relate this to fellow Terran players is when a Protoss opens up with an Oracle on you and he doesn't lose that Oracle, you can't really push out until you're properly defended against Oracle play, right? Now if a Protoss player opens with a fast Oracle and just flies it in and it dies like immediately because he does something stupid with it, then you feel much more at ease, much more at home. You're ready to continue with your game plan. You're not under any pressure, right? That's the point of positional drops, to put your opponent under pressure to stay in his base or to pull his army to a different place that you want it to be in. Alright, so the next type of drop I'm going to talk about is what's called a damage drop. Now, a damage drop is designed to do either economic damage or tech damage or both, right? So when you're going for a damage drop, you don't necessarily care where your opponent's army is. You're purely trying to do a whole bunch of damage to your opponent and then pull your units out. So when you go for a damage drop, a lot of times in the early game you can do it with like a single medevac loaded with like 4 Widow Mines, 4 Hellions, something like that, and you go after your opponent's economy because he doesn't really have any tech structures up yet, right? So what you do is you drop your 2 Widow Mines off in his natural, you drop 2 off in his main, and if your opponent is slow at reacting, or doesn't have detection, you're going to do a ton of damage to him, right? That's the point of a damage drop, to really make your opponent pay, and that's how you do it in the early game. Now, as the game shifts to later game and your opponent's on like 3 bases, this is when damage drops start to become like 2 medevacs deep, right? So you load up your bioforce in your medevac, and you'll land it in your opponent's base with your two two chunks of a bio army. You see that spire, you go right for it, you gun that thing down. Your opponent's still kind of slow at recovering, so you're gunning down a bunch of lings, then you gun down his roach warren, then you pick up and leave and you go prepare to attack because you set yourself up for a timing, right? You've done a whole bunch of damage to your opponent. Again, the key with damage drops is you're not trying to land, run everything in 3 bases and suicide, because that's never a good thing. You always want to make sure you're picking those units up. But when you go for a damage drop, it's okay to scan ahead. But it's really important that when you do go for these, you're picking your units up and you're targeting the right kind of structures that are going to make your next fight easy to win, right? If you're hitting a Protoss player and he doesn't really have any Templar, or you spot the Templar archives just finishing up, you go in, you smash the Templar archives. He doesn't have Storm, so you don't really need Ghosts yet. You can kind of stack up your Viking count because he's going to need Colossus, right? Whereas the opposite is true. If you've only scouted your opponent and he has 1, maybe 2 Colossus, and you go in there and you hit up that Robo Bay and you knock it out of commission and then you pick up and leave, you still have that chunk of your army, which is great, which is going to set up a timing for you to go in and attack your opponent with kind of a smaller Viking count than otherwise you would normally need. So it's really important with damage drops that you do get your units out, but these ones you can load up a little bit heavier into that kind of 2 medevac count. Now, it's really important to note that when you are going for a damage drop, there's risk involved, right? And the risk-reward ratio on 2 medevacs is really, really good. If your opponent doesn't defend it properly, you're in really, really good shape. If your opponent defends it, loses some units, maybe picks off the medevacs with some blink stalkers so your units can't get out and you trade kind of cost effectively, hey, that's awesome. If you go in and both your medevacs just get shot out of the sky and they don't drop any units off, that puts you in a really bad position, but it's far from game ending. But when you go do a damage drop and you do it a little more Doom Drop style and you have 4 or 5 medevacs available against a bad player, yeah, it'll do a lot of damage. But if a player's on top of the ball and he just blinks a bunch of stalkers underneath and throws out feedbacks and you lose all 5 of those medevacs, you just lost the game. Right? The same thing applies with if you go in, you crash into your opponent's base, you smash the Spire, you smash the Roach Warren, but then a whole bunch of Baneleys come in and just smash up the rest of your units and your army basically doesn't exist anymore because you got to take a really advantageous fight against a portion of your army, you're going to lose the game because he just has to counterattack to win. So it's really important when you go for damage drops that you don't load them up too hard and you make sure you get the units out because, again, there is risk there. Alright. The next drop I'm going to talk about is the Doom Drop. Now, I'm sure everybody out there really, really likes and enjoys the Doom Drop. The Doom Drop's a lot of fun to do. I love doing them, but it is so rare in terms of actual circumstance of when it can be effective. You have to be very, very careful. When I watch Platinum players stream or Diamond players stream or even Masters players stream, a lot of times they're like, I don't know what to do. My opponent's really turtled up. I'm not sure how I can go about winning this game. Well, they could do a positional drop, they could do a nice damage drop. Instead, they just load up all 6 of their medevacs or 8 of their medevacs and they go Doom Drop. And what happens? Well, they snipe all the tech and they snipe the hive and they snipe everything, and then their army just gets destroyed. Same thing against Protoss, right? If you're trying to Doom Drop a Protoss player and he storms and has Colossus, your army's just going to get mopped because you have nowhere to go, nowhere to kite in your opponent's main base. You cannot Doom Drop that situation. Now, there is one situation where a Doom Drop is okay, and that one situation is in Terran versus Terran when you're going for Marine tank, right? And the reason it's okay to do it in that situation is if you do a Doom Drop into your opponent's production. So let's say you're playing on Daybreak, which I know is a map that's not in the map pool anymore, but if you're on Daybreak, it's actually really easy to Doom Drop your opponent. He has to be very careful. So let's say you scan, you go, okay, his defenses into his main are very, very weak. You've got 10 or 12 medevacs. You load your whole army up in there, and you burn over. You land, you siege up your tanks. With your opponent's SimCity, his choke points, he's simply just going to lose the game because he has to break, he has to try to break that, but it's a position he can't break out of because his SimCity does not favor him. You've got a very favorable position. You're essentially forcing your opponent to attack into a really, really bad spot with that Doom Drop. So again, there's very, very few situations where Doom Drops are okay, and they're a good decision, but when they are a decision, you're going for it to win the game. That's kind of the point with a Doom Drop. When you're playing your own games, I highly recommend you simply do not utilize a Doom Drop unless it's a situation like I talked about where you're playing against another Terran player and you can Doom Drop straight into his production. If you're playing against a Protoss or a Zerg, Doom Drops don't really work. because there's just you can't do enough damage to really mess them up, right? Like, Protoss players' production spread out all over the place. They have Warp Gate, they have Storm Colossus. They're going to clear your army up with no problem if you can't kite. Against Zerg, it might be a little more difficult for them to clear your army up, but you're not going to do enough damage because they just, they'll have a few tech structures and stuff there, but it's nothing that can't be accomplished with a simple damage drop, so there's really no point in going for a Doom drop in that situation, when another drop would work just as effectively, right? Alright. The next drop I'm going to talk about is the Doom drop. Now, I'm sure everybody out there really likes and enjoys the Doom drop. The Doom drop's a lot of fun to do. I love doing them, but it is so rare in terms of actual circumstance of when it can be effective. You have to be very careful. When I watch Platinum players stream or Diamond players stream or even Masters players stream, a lot of times they're like, I don't know what to do, my opponent's really turtled up, I'm not sure how I can go about winning this game. Well, they could do a positional drop, they could do a nice damage drop. Instead, they just load up all 6 of their medivacs or 8 of their medivacs and they go Doom drop. And what happens? Well, they snipe all the tech and they snipe the hive and they snipe everything, and then their army just gets destroyed. Same thing against Protoss, right? Like, if you're trying to Doom drop a Protoss player, and he storms and has Colossus, like, your army's just going to get mopped because you have nowhere to go, nowhere to kite in your opponent's main base. You cannot Doom drop that situation. Now, there is one situation where a Doom drop is okay, and that one situation is in Terran versus Terran when you're going for, like, Marine tank, right? And the reason it's okay to do it in that situation is if you do a Doom drop into your opponent's production. So let's say you're playing on Daybreak, which I know is a map that's not in the map pool anymore, but if you're on Daybreak, it's actually really easy to Doom drop your opponent. He has to be very careful. So let's say you scan, you go, okay, his defenses into his main are very weak. You've got like 10 or 12 medivacs. You load your whole army up in there, and you burn over. You land, you siege up your tanks with your opponent's SimCity, his choke points. He's simply just going to lose the game because he has to break, he has to try to break that, but it's a position he can't break out of because his SimCity does not favor him. You've got a very favorable position. You're essentially forcing your opponent to attack into a really bad spot with that Doom drop. So again, there's very few situations where Doom drops are okay, and they're a good decision, but when they are a decision, you're going for it to win the game. That's kind of the point with a Doom drop. When you're playing your own games, I highly recommend you simply do not utilize a Doom drop unless it's a situation like I talked about where you're playing against another Terran player and you can Doom drop straight into his production. If you're playing against a Protoss or a Zerg, Doom drops don't really work because there's just you can't do enough damage to really mess them up, right? Like, Protoss players' production spread out all over the place. They have Warp Gate, they have Storm Colossus. They're going to clear your army up with no problem if you can't kite. Against Zerg, it might be a little more difficult for them to clear your army up, but you're not going to do enough damage because they just, they'll have a few tech structures and stuff there, but it's nothing that can't be accomplished with a simple damage drop, so there's really no point in going for a Doom drop in that situation, when another drop would work just as effectively, right? Alright, so the last type of drop I wanted to talk about was the suicide drop or the hellbat drop. Now, the reason I'm kind of putting this in its own category is because the number one thing with drops is you want them to be threatening and cost effective. Now, the thing about hellbat drops is right now, they go beyond cost effective. If you fly into your opponent's base, you wait to boost, he starts pulling all his probes, you boost, you land on top of them, and you kill 15 probes, the medevac and the hellbats can do whatever they want from that point in the rest of the game. They can kill each other, and it really doesn't matter. It's not very important, right? So when you're doing, that really aggressive kind of suicide drop play, basically how it works is, you're using small chunks of your army to rush in and do a lot of damage, right? In a situation where your opponent either is prepared, has a lot of static defense, or your drop really doesn't have any chance of getting away. Now, hellbats are by far the safest option for this because even if your opponent is properly prepared for it, because you can only get 2 hellbats into a medevac, they drop out almost instantly, so sniping the medevac isn't really an option. And then from there, the hellbats are probably going to be cost effective against probes or drones or SCVs because they do so much damage to them. So again, with a suicide drop, the main point of it is it really only works with hellbats, although you can do it with other units, but for the most part, you're just looking to do it with hellbats, and it's okay. Like, all you do is load up, one medevac with two hellbats. Maybe you have a second one, you drop 4 hellbats, and you just bomb in and suicide. The drop's gonna die, But when you're doing these kind of suicide drops, it's most effective if you kind of hit 2 or 3 places at once, because you force your opponent to multitask while you don't have to, right? So if you just boost in like 3 medivacs worth of hellbats to 3 different bases, your opponent is going to take damage. Your overall situation from that point on is going to be successful. But it's really important you understand that this only really works with units like the hellbat, where you know those units are simply, they're not going to get out alive. There's almost no way to pull it out, right? But it's still going to be cost effective. And I didn't really want to talk about it too much because I'm starting to play a lot of mech personally. So suicide hellbat drops are really good against Protoss. I don't think you really need to do suicide drops against Zerg, because it's pretty easy to pick up your hellbats and keep the threat of the drop alive. Against Protoss, it's much more difficult with things like blink stalkers, photon cannons, Nexus overcharge. Like, to get in and get out is very hard. But against Terran and Zerg, a lot of times you can. If the Terran doesn't have bunkers and he only has 1, maybe 2 missile turrets trying to defend against the hellbat drops, then you can do suicide hellbat drops. But I really don't recommend doing straight up suicide hellbat drops against Zerg, although it can work. And yeah, I just really want to touch on the suicide drop a little bit roughly. It's important you differentiate, the suicide drop from being good drop play, because it goes against every single rule that ever existed in drop play. However, it's so cost effective, it makes it worthwhile. So again, hellbats, they work with suicide drops. Pretty much everything else, try not to do it. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this particular episode of Bronze to Masters. Hopefully you enjoyed the games that I put in the background. Tried to pick one that was against one of my friends, Doomby, who runs a Breaking Bronze stream. And that was a lot of suicide hellbat drops. And I'm still looking through trying to figure out what I'm going to use for the second replay. But I like to record all the audio up front. And yeah, hopefully this episode kind of helped you out. Hopefully you understand, how to do drop play a little bit better yourself. When you do want to learn how to go do proper drop play, go watch the top tier Terrans that stream. You're going to watch them not lose drops, basically ever. And it's going to make it very, very, very difficult on their opponents. Anyway guys, I will be back again for another episode of Terran Heart of the Swarm Bronze to Masters. You can find me on Twitter at FilterStarcraft. You can find my stream on twitch.tv /FilterSC. And I will see you guys next time.